Henry, welcome to the podcast. I'm delighted to have you. Um,
Mm.
One of my questions is a large part of your academic work is focused on the topic of organization design. How important is it for organizations to get their organization structure right, and why? How high should this topic feature on the agenda of executive committees and supervisory boards, and how much attention do you think it actually gets?
Well, sometimes it gets much too much attention, or at least the wrong kind of attention, because of the chart. Everything's about the chart. I maintain that if you want to redesign an organization, you need a piece of paper and a pencil with a good eraser. And he goes here and she goes there, and lo and behold, you've reorganized the way heads of state, the way prime ministers or presidents reorganize their cabinets. It's the most popular way to change an organization because it's the easiest. Of course, it doesn't change that much. Who you report to has some importance, but it's overdone. So do organizations give enough attention to it? Maybe we could say they give the wrong attention to it. The structure is important. Who reports to who is somewhat important, but not the be all and end all. And so it's the whole aspect of structure. Architectural structure is as important as organization structure. And by that, I mean who sits next to who. Instead of reorganizing the chart, reorganize the offices because a lot of things happen at the coffee machine. So a little too much attention sometimes.
Your latest book, Understanding Organizations Finally Structuring in Sevens, is an update of your seminal works, The Structuring of Organizations from 1979 and Structuring Fives from 1983. How has your thinking about organizations evolved in the last 40 years? And what are some of the changes and updates you made in your latest book as a result?
Well, I kind of rewrote the book partly because I wanted to make the point that hadn't been made where I wanted to make it, which is that we live in a world of organizations and we don't understand them. And my earlier writings were much more academic with lots of references and all that. Even
Yeah.
Structure Fives, which has many fewer, still has quite a few. And I wanted to reach a broader audience. Yeah. Now, if you look at the five main forms, in the earlier book, I mean, four of them and one elsewhere are prominent in this book, but I think I say it much more clearly, much more distinctly. Um, so, and the big change for me, and it really struck me because I knew all about outward bound and what I call what I'm using the term outward bound for all the outsourcing and joint ventures and all
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
That was quite evident. But what struck me is when I thought about it, when I started in this field, the predominant strategies of big corporations were diversification and vertical integration. You went into new businesses either by extending your value chain, bought up your suppliers or your customers, or you diversified into new businesses either internally or by purchasing other companies. But the boundaries of the organization in those respects was absolutely firm and
Yeah.
definitive.
Yeah.
And
It was an organogram captured in a legal entity. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And what's changed now is those borders have been blown wide open in many companies, many or all kinds of organizations. And so the second to last chapter sort of gets into that as the biggest change. But I think the whole book is meant to update, clarify, extend, and so on. It's not a radically different book from the first one, but I think it's significantly different.
In your latest book, you write that every organization form contains the seed of its own destruction. Could you perhaps elaborate on this statement and indicate what a takeaway of this message should probably be for executive committees and supervisory boards of organizations?
Yeah, well, I use the word organization form in a very specific sense. By that, I mean organizations that tend to adopt one particular structure or another. In the book, is largely about what I call personal enterprises, program machines, professional assemblies, and project pioneers. Um, if you're only that, the most programmed machine, let's say McDonald's, still needs creative advertising in project work. It still needs professionals in its accounting department and so on and so forth. So the forms tend to get carried away. Um, whenever you start programming everything. My joke about McDonald's is that it programs the customers. We clear our tables.
Yeah, yeah,
You wouldn't dream
exactly.
of
Yeah.
you wouldn't dream of not clearing your table in McDonald's. You're programmed by McDonald's. So that's okay. That works for them. But getting too carried away can be dangerous for any form. They all have their flaws, and therefore they all have to be somewhat hybrid, even if it's minimally, not minimally, but moderately.
The traditional approach to changing organizations seems to exist and consist of 3 to 5 year cycles where organizations are radically designed, e.g., from product-oriented to market-oriented ones, only to be changed back 3 to 5 years later. Standard features of this approach include external consultants to prepare the design of the organization, the involvement of change and communication specialists to deal with the expected resistance, and the totally confused staff who do not understand the necessity of the change in the first place. Instead, you seem to plead for a different approach. And I quote, organizations require emergent structures, just as they require emergent strategies. When possible, start marginally, tentatively, and let experience take it from there. Could you perhaps explain your thinking of organization change on that point?
Yeah. They used to say about McKinsey that if you were centralized, they decentralized you, and if you were decentralized, they centralized you. Except those are very limited uses of those words, because what they really meant is you went from a product structure to or some kind of output structure, products, businesses, to a functional structure and back and forth. That's one aspect of structure, but it's hardly the only aspect of structure. In some sense, if you look at an organization culturally, they don't change that much at all, the good ones, if the culture is working. On the other hand, at the other level, as you mentioned about emergent structure, people are always reorganizing in small ways. They're always adapting to what they have to be doing. That maybe they were having a hands-off, maybe marketing and sales were having a distant relationship, and then they discover that they better get together because there's some problem in a certain product line, and then they create a project. The organization doesn't reorganize, they just get together and create a project. So there's a lot of restructuring going on, and these cycles. All of this is about I get in at the end of the book to the whole notion of design, and this idea that your structure that you work in is designed for you by someone else. You are told who your boss is, and what unit you're supposed to work in, and so on and so forth, and that's very limited. We need to design structures for ourselves and that work for us in minor and sometimes major ways. And my favorite story is about pathways. In Prague, there's a park, a new park that joins a road to a bridge, and the designers decided how the pathways should go, and they did it like this.
Yeah. I got a fine there once because I basically crossed it straight away, and there was a policeman that obviously wasn't pleased by that. Yeah.
Yeah, the people just made their own
Yeah,
pathway.
exactly. Yeah.
Pathway. And they should have left the paths unmade, let the people walk, and then pave where they go instead of forcing everybody to do this. There are two kinds of experts in some ways. There are experts who know better, like surgeons. They know where to cut. I'm not going to tell them where to cut. And experts who, by knowing better, do worse. like architects who know better than their clients, or organization designers who know better than the people who have to live in those organizations. So we need to kind of rethink how we view organization design.
Yeah, maybe you should almost if you think about design thinking, you almost should think about a kind of human-centric design. So in the
Yeah,
sense of, what is a natural inclination, what will by nature work, rather than basically forcing some kind of artificial structure where people need to
exactly.
adapt.
Yeah, and I call it design doing, not design thinking, but design doing.
Yeah. Do you think there is a fit between the personality of a leader and the structure of the organization? And is that helpful or even required? So, for instance, does leading a professional assembly require different skills than leading a program machine or a project pioneer organization, for instance? Or should every leader be able to manage every type of organizational structure?
Well, the answer to the last question is no. Um, you know, we had a business school that appointed the head of a trucking company as the dean. And he said managing professors is like managing truckers. And so all the good professor truckers left, and he was left with the others. So, so no, not everybody can manage everything. On the other hand, the answer to the earlier question is kind of yes and no, I think, because yes, because a fit makes sense. You work with the organization, you fit the organization, it fits you. But sometimes you need leadership that is the opposite. If you're too heavy a program machine, and everything is so programmed, everything is so bureaucratic, then you don't need a bureaucrat to run the place. You may need an adhocrat, somebody flexible to run it, to pull the organization in a different direction. So it depends on the circumstances. Sometimes you want tight fit, sometimes you don't.
Yeah. And in that same vein, if you think about people like Steve Jobs and until recently Elon Musk, they appear to defy conventional organizational principles. Despite the expensive scale and diverse product lines of Apple and Tesla, these organizations seem to diverge from the anticipated divisional structure. And instead, they resemble more of a personal enterprise model due to the hands-on involvement of the likes of Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. Why do you think these companies thrive despite their unconventional structures?
Well, I don't think they're unconventional at all. I think they're entrepreneurial.
Hmm.
It's not unconventional. It may be unconventional in terms of a lot of the literature that's very bureaucratic, very machine-like,
Yeah,
controls and measures and all that stuff. But both of them, Musk and Jobs, were classic entrepreneurs. And Apple, as long as Jobs was there, was a hybrid of a of a personal enterprise, an entrepreneurial enterprise, and a project organization, largely, not exclusively, but largely. And so they weren't unconventional at all. Now, Jobs was certainly unconventional in that he spent his mornings in the lab working on product. I mean, you find me a book that says the CEO should work in the lab on product. Um, so that was unconventional and utterly unacceptable. He should have been in his office reading financial statements, but all he did was create more
and talking to
shareholder.
analysts and stakeholders and investors. Yeah,
Yeah, so he created more value for those stockholders than anybody in history to that point. So, and it still maintains itself even after he's gone. So, so, so that was unconventional, but change the convention. Don't change the man in the job, the person in the job. As far as Musk is concerned, last year, Forbes magazine asked a few people who were the greatest and worst CEOs of the past year, and I said Elon Musk. Um, he was the greatest in Tesla, although maybe not now, I don't know, and the worst in Twitter. But
yeah.
But he wasn't an entrepreneur in Twitter. He was an entrepreneur in Tesla. He knew the business. He wasn't an entrepreneur in Twitter, and he didn't know the business, and he screwed it up royally.
Yeah. And is this something you think that established organizations can learn from, Apple under Steve Jobs, Tesla under Elon Musk, or do you say, well, it's these are such unique individuals, that there's nothing to replicate there?
Well, if General Motors tried to bring in Steve Jobs, which is inconceivable, um, wouldn't work very well. You can't suddenly bring in an entrepreneur. And often when you bring in these people who want to change everything, they kind of screw up royally. They don't necessarily know the business that well. So it's not that one form can learn from another. I mean, the ultimate bureaucratic machine has projects going on. As I said about McDonald's, they have advertising programs and so on and so forth. They need creativity, even new product design and new product development. Um, so, so, so they can all learn from each other, but you can't replicate the other one. If you're in mass production, don't pretend you're a professional assembly or program machine. Board people on the boards of hospitals who think they should be run by program machines are a threat to our health because they're going to kill the organization.
And generally speaking, we consider a strong culture in organizations as something positive and conflicts as something negative. However, you write that culture and conflicts coexist in organizations, sometimes to keep each other in check. And in your book, you write that the culture of inclusiveness can constrain the intrusiveness of conflict, just as the intrusiveness of conflict can loosen a culture that has become too inclusive. Could you perhaps explain your thinking on this point? Because that sounds like very, very original thinking.
Yeah, I've been called a contrarian often enough.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't think I'm a contrarian at all. And I think this statement is an example of this. A contrarian is someone who says things for their own outrage, whereas this statement seems to me perfectly obvious, at least after it's said, and maybe not before it's said, but after it's said, in the sense that culture brings us together and conflict drives us apart. If culture brings us too close together, we need conflict to drive us apart. And if driving us apart becomes too strong, when an organization becomes political, then we need culture to pull it together. So those two forces can work in tandem to keep an organization healthy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other question is, how do you, let's say, see the relationship between the structure and the culture of an organization?
Well, for one thing, the structure is a culture. The culture is a structure. In a sense, there are cultural aspects to any structure. So the culture of a professional assembly is very much everybody for themselves, individualistic. It's a kind of occupational or professional kind of culture, and you structure accordingly. So the two, it's like the question about who should lead different forms of organizations. And what kind of culture should you have in different forms of organizations? Sometimes you need it stronger or get it stronger, like in personal enterprises. The culture in Apple must have been amazing when Jobs was there, for example.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just carry merrily along. It doesn't matter that much.
Yeah. And what is your let's say take on the fact that sometimes organizations deliberately want to address their culture, right? They want to look into what are our values, what do we actually stand for as an organization, to write mission statements and incorporate it in their HR policies. What is your take on that one, to basically try to change an organization by starting with this culture?
You can kill a culture quite easily. I mean, somewhere in the book, there's a box on 5 easy ways to kill an organization. And you're really killing the culture. Just treat people miserably and, hire and fire them like mad and so on and so forth. Um, I still don't know the difference between mission statements, vision statements, value statements. To me, I've seen organizations. I remember recently an organization that had a mission statement, a vision statement, a value statement. It's laughable. I mean, it's just by the book. It was laughable. Actually, the organization was a business school um, that proposed every one of these, and it's kind of like, yeah, it's just silly. I mean, words don't mean anything unless you do something serious with them. And I remember once British Airways, which is up and down, not only the planes, but I remember once it was the hot company. They were fabulous, and I happened to have to get on a flight to Jersey from London when there were no seats available, but I had just done a program and there was somebody from BA on the program and he got me into the jump seat, which is with the pilots.
Yeah, I
And
know. Yeah.
so I had a chance to say, like, this amazing cultural revolution in BA, is it real? I said, oh yeah, yeah, it's really great. And I said, so how's it changed your job? Oh, it hasn't changed my job at all. Oh, what's what's a cultural revolution that doesn't change your job? It's like every time the National Health Service of England or any other similar organization reorganizes, what effect does that have on a surgeon who's putting in a stent?
Yeah.
So the bosses change, so big deal. You
Yeah.
guys are playing these games. I'm putting in stents. One has nothing to do with the other. So what's the point?
Yeah. You also write that there's often a disconnect between the people in the organization who formulate the strategy and the ones that need to execute it. In the best case, this results in successful strategies that are implemented without ever being formulated or intended, so-called emergent strategies. However, more often than not, conflicts arise between the formulators and the implementers of corporate strategies because the strategic objectives are not realized. Which approach could organizations take to address the gap between the formulators and the implementers of strategies?
Well, I think they can start by dropping those words, um, because because when a strategy fails, what gets blamed? It's always implementation, and the reason is that it's usually the formulators who are blaming. They're telling the implementers that you dumbbells were not smart enough to implement our brilliant strategy. Um, well, if the dumbbells were smart, they would turn around and say, if you're so smart, why didn't you formulate strategy that we and dumbbells were capable of implementing? After all, you knew who we were. In other words, every failure of implementation is also a failure of formulation because you got to formulate for the implementers. Can't formulate in general, you got to formulate for the people who have to implement. But the real problem is the separation that somehow you separate formulation from implementation. In other words, you plan strategy instead of learn strategy. And I think the real powerful strategies are learned on the ground, like a worker at IKEA who tried to put a table in his car and it didn't fit. So he took the legs off. And then somebody said, wait a minute, if we have to take the legs off, so do our customers. And
Yeah.
that changed the furniture business. So, so that's where strategies come from, the really interesting ones. They're little anomalies that are made into big deals.
Yeah. It's my personal impression, and you might disagree with me that the interest in structuring organizations as a kind of field of study and as an area of focus and attention has reduced a little bit in the last 10 to 15 years, both in the business and the academic world. Do you agree with that statement, or do you see completely different movements going on?
It's hard to follow those trends because I don't necessarily read all the literature at this point and kind of keep up with what's going on. But my take on that would be it's always been an orphan in the business schools. If you're talking about within the business schools and research, there are many organization theorists and people interested in organization studies like yourself and me. But it's never been mainstream. Many Business schools don't have courses, required courses in organization theory. How can you send someone out to work in an organization without teaching them what an organization is? They don't have courses in management. How can you send them out and pretend you're training them to be managers when you don't even have a course on management itself? So I think they've always been the orphans of the business schools. There are many, many people write about them, and they talk to each other, and they get read, like Jay Galbraith and people like that, who have been widely read. But it's not strength. If you look at finance in business schools, it's so rooted. If you look at organizational behavior, it's so rooted. I think in practice, there's probably more activity in practice. There are more groups like your own interested in organization design in practice because they've got to live with it and do it. But I'm not sure it compares with the number of groups and the size of groups on leadership, on HR, or organization dynamics, or those things. I'm not sure it's as prominent.
Mhm.
So what I'm saying is, I'm not sure it's worse. I think it's always been underrepresented.
True. Yeah. Hey, Henry, we touched on a number of areas around organizations and organization structures in this interview. Are there any things that we haven't touched on which you would like to mention?
Um, yes and no. Yes, I'm sure there's a million things we haven't discussed, and none of them occurred to me. I think you've covered it very well, Dirk. So I think you've covered it very well.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, I really enjoyed it, Henry. It was great talking to you. It is,
Okay, great talking to you.
yeah.